What's going on, everyone? Stefi Cohen here, and I'm going to be covering Big in the Basics, specifically for the squat today. So the first thing that I like to think about when I'm teaching someone how to squat is making sure that they have the appropriate mobility and stability in different joints in order to put a barbell in their backs. So a common mistake that a lot of people make is, especially beginners, is going into things way too fast and trying to progress too quickly. You need to be patient and make sure that your body is ready for the movement that you're trying to do, and also to keep adding weight to the movement that you're trying to get better at. So the three main joints that are important to take into consideration in a squat are your ankle joint, your knee joint, and your hip joint. So each of those joints plays an imperative role in the squat. Each serves a different function. So for the ankle joint, you want to make sure that it has the adequate mobility in order for you to be able to achieve a full depth squat. When it comes to the knee, you want to make sure that it has the adequate stability to ensure that it can sustain the load that you're going to put on your back. And I'm gonna cover how you assess that joint by joint. And finally, the hip joint, you want to make sure that it has both enough mobility for you to be able to achieve proper depth and enough stability for you to be safe in that position. And the stability of the hip joint is, of course, dependent on more than one thing, especially because of its location. You got to take into consideration that what happens above and what happens below the joint is going to have an impact on what happens at the hip. So just keep that in mind, making sure that your spine is also stable enough, and making sure that things below the hip are working appropriately is gonna make a huge difference. So let's talk about the ankle first. And this is a topic of contention and controversy, if you may, whether or not you need lifting shoes or shoes with a heel or you don't. And I think a big portion of it is personal preference, assuming that you do have enough mobility at the ankle. So I'm gonna run through a quick test that you can do at home by yourself to determine whether or not your ankles have the appropriate mobility to achieve a proper squat. So first thing you're gonna do, you're gonna take your shoes off, right? So consider this part A of the assessment. So what you're gonna do is face sideways in a mirror, okay? And what you're gonna do is we're gonna squat down. You can put your hands in front of you, or you can cross them out, and try to have your hips go below the top of your knee, or even if you can, go a little bit lower. If your heels lift up, that's a failed test. So a lot of people, what they will do is they will squat down and you'll see the heels coming up, or even you'll see a little bit of pronation of the foot to accommodate or to compensate for the lack of ankle mobility. That would be considered a failed test, okay? The next thing you're gonna do, if you fail that test, you're gonna grab a plate that will essentially act as a provisional heel. So you're gonna put it on the floor, same position, mirror on the side. Now you're gonna elevate your heels, you're gonna drop down to your squat, and you're gonna see whether or not that changed anything in your position. So a common mistake that people make when they're squatting, even just a body weight squat, is you'll see that they drop down and their hips, their pelvis rounds and looses. They lose control at the bottom of the squat. That would also be considered a failed test. If you put your heels on and you lose that core stability and you lose your lumbopelvic rhythm, then that would be considered a failed test. If you were able to squat all the way down appropriately with your spine neutral, your spine and pelvis in neutral, and your heels fully touching the plates, then that would be considered a pass test. If you pass both tests, then you can choose whether or not you want to wear a heel or not. So there you have it. You can do your own ankle mobility assessment and determine whether or not you need your shoes, your heels, or you don't. Moving on to the next joint, the knee. The knee is really important for stability, and The main way that you can assess whether or not your knees are ready both of your knees are ready to withstand a barbell with full weight is doing a quick single leg test. The way you do that, you can either just do it on the floor or do it on an elevated surface, such as this one. And all that you're gonna do is it's a mini squat. So only like about 30 degrees of knee flexion, that's all that you're looking at. You don't need a super huge deficit. And what you're gonna do, you're gonna tap the ground and come back up. You're gonna do that 5 times. And what you're looking at, you should do it in front of a mirror, of course. And what you're looking at is the amount of motion that's coming from the knee. So ideally, an ideal situation would be that the knee tracks in between the width of your foot. So it doesn't like go in like that or go out like that or even wiggles down. That's what you wanna look at. You wanna make sure that you have full control over that joint to prevent unnecessary motions and essentially to prevent or to make your movement more efficient when you're squatting and prevent power leaks so that you can exert the most amount of force into that bar, into the floor, and lift the most. And then finally at the hip, it's a similar assessment as the squat. It basically just involves you squatting on a mirror or sideways in front of a mirror and determining whether or not you can maintain a proper pelvic position, a neutral pelvic position, a stable position as you're squatting down, and ensuring that there's no loss of pelvic neutrality at the bottom of the squat. And this is really important because, like I was saying, it's important not to skip steps if you're a beginner, if you're getting into strength training, because you want to ensure that your body is ready and it's capable for you to put a barbell behind your back. Progression that people forget about is ensuring that you master the fundamentals, the fundamental movements prior to a squat. So can you do a bodyweight squat with full structural control? Moving on from that, can you do a goblet squat, maintaining a proper upright chest position, maintaining proper hip position, maintaining your heels on the ground? Then following that, some argue that a front squat might be the next progression. So can you do a front squat even with your hands in front of you like that? And then you can do a back squat. But it is important that you have a checklist of all these movements and that you ensure that you can do all of them prior to putting a barbell with weight on your back. So remember, don't skip steps. Make sure that you're following the progressions and that your body is ready for each stage. So be patient. Now, getting into the fun part, now that you're ready for the bar, I'm gonna go through a few cues that I use and the technique that I like to implement both personally and for my athletes or clients that I coach. And it's a little bit different. There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to, for example, the speed of a squat, how fast you should be squatting down. But I do believe that there is something to say about the intent and the way that you are squatting, the intent and what's going through your head. So when I squat, and when I teach people how to squat, I like for people to go slow, especially on the way down. And it's not necessarily considered a tempo squat, how some people would say, oh, it's just slowing down the movement. It's not. It's also about what you're thinking about and what kind of muscles you are summoning upon, what kind of muscles you're activating as you're doing this movement. So this concept is not something that I invented, although it's something that I discovered through practice and then was able to confirm via evidence, via research, literature. And that is, it's a concept known in neuroanatomy as successive induction. And successive induction basically involves the activation of an antagonist muscle prior to the contraction of an agonist to accentuate the contraction of the agonist muscle. So what does that mean in normal terms? When it comes, I'll give you an easy example before I get into the hip because there's a lot of muscles involved in the hip. But for example, the agonist muscle in a bicep curl is your biceps, and the antagonist muscle is your tricep. So if you wanted to apply the concept of successive induction to a bicep curl, when you do the curl, you should also be thinking about trying to contract your tricep And essentially that would make the second, third, fourth rep of that bicep curl even more forceful. You can apply that to the squats, the same concept of, so in a squat, your agonist muscles are gonna be your glutes, hamstrings, and quads. Obviously, each muscle acting at different portions of the squat with more and less intensity. But the antagonist muscle in a squat would be your hip flexors. So when you do these squats, these slow squats, I want you to think about not only slowing down the movement, but activating your hip flexors as much as possible in order to generate more tension at the hip and essentially a more stable pelvis and a more stable hip. And this concept is known as co-contraction. Like I said, there's many muscles involved at the hip. You can't only think about a squat as being an exercise that's for your quads or for your glutes or for your hamstrings. You gotta know there's over 20 muscles acting on the hip, involving in the lateral hip, even like inside muscles that you can't see, muscles that attach from the sacrum onto the hip that are all acting forces on your hip to stabilize. The hip flexors are an important one, and if you can master kind of like that mind-body connection with them as you're squatting, it'll make your squat that much more stable and that much more forceful. And I've talked about power leaks before, earlier on this video, and that's essentially what you're trying to avoid. You're trying to create a structure that is solid, that's a solid unit, that has the minimum amount of leaks so you can produce the most amount of force from the ground onto that barbell. So what you're gonna do, as you're coming down, think about bending at the hip. So it's not only kind of free falling, or it's not only slowing it down. Think about your hip flexors and what their action is. Your hip flexors bend at your hip. So that's exactly what you're gonna do. You're gonna accentuate you bending at the hip, tensing the hip flexors as you come down, and boom, then you come up. So remember, not only the speed, but also the intention and the summoning power of those hip flexors. And the final thing that I wanted to discuss was hand placement and bar placement. So hand placement, obviously personal preference. A big limiting factor is your external rotation mobility. So you'll see a lot of bigger guys really struggle with putting their hands on the bar. Some of them can't even wrap their full thumbs around the bar, so they keep a suicide grip. But ultimately, yes, it's going to be determined by the amount of flexibility that you have on your shoulders. But I like to teach people, if the mobility is there, to stay as close to their body as possible, because that way you bring your center of mass closer to you, and that is going to make it easier for you to lift, because you're a tighter unit. You're going to feel a lot more sturdy and a lot stronger in that position. But of course, it's not a rule. It's just a recommendation. You don't have to do it that way. You can do it just according to your flexibility in your shoulders and essentially what feels better to you. But if you do have the mobility, start narrow, then maybe work your way around. The second thing would be bar placement. When it comes to powerlifting, I think the preferred style is low bar. Personally, I don't think it's gonna make that big of a difference if you place the bar 2 inches higher or 2 inches lower. I don't think that's gonna make a huge difference. But again, it's all personal preference. If you want to squat high bar and you feel stronger in that position, or you want to squat low bar and you feel stronger in that position. Of course, a low bar squat will call upon your glutes and hamstrings a lot more. It's a more hip dominant movement, and a high bar squat is a lot more quad dominant. You'll be able to keep a more upright torso with that movement. So you can see it, I'll do the high bar first. The high bar pretty much forces you to stay upright. This is a preferred squatting style for a lot of Olympic weightlifters, even though some of them even do both. And then the low bar squat, basically just place the bar a couple inches lower on your back, and you'll see that it forces you to lean your chest forward a little bit more. And then finally, the elbow position. I think that's an important one. You want to make sure that there's no elbow flare out when you're doing it, because that's gonna make you drop your chest forward. You wanna keep your elbows in line with your torso so that you can push that bar up when you're coming out of the hole. And that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Big in the Basics. Stay tuned for the next episode. We're gonna be covering bench.